By the time Eleanor Vale came to live at Ashcombe Cottage, the roses had finished blooming. They hung in faded clusters along the southern wall, their petals curled inward like small hands grown tired of holding on. The path beneath them was scattered with leaves, though autumn had not yet properly begun, and the old brass knocker on the front door had turned nearly green with age. Eleanor stood before it with the key in her palm and listened to the silence. It was not the silence she had known in the city, where quiet was only the brief suspension of machinery, traffic, footsteps, telephones, and the murmuring lives of strangers behind adjoining walls. This silence seemed older. It lay across the cottage roof, the orchard beyond it, and the low stone wall at the end of the garden. It rested in the hedgerows. It waited in the fields. For several moments, she did not unlock the door. She had imagined this arrival many times during the journey. In some versions, she felt relief. In others, regret. Once or twice, she had pictured herself turning back before she ever reached the gate. Now that she was here, she felt neither grief nor regret. She felt only tired. The cottage had belonged to her Aunt Margaret, who had lived there for nearly 40 years and died quietly in early spring. Margaret had never married, though she had not been a lonely woman. Her letters had always been full of people Eleanor had never met. The Baker's twins, Mrs. Pembroke's failing knees, a boy called Thomas who played the violin badly, but with conviction, and someone she referred to only as the keeper. Eleanor had never asked who the keeper was. At the time, she had been too occupied with her own life, which seemed then to require constant tending. There were bills, obligations, conversations postponed and resumed, relationships that slowly loosened until they fell away altogether. There had not been a job she once believed mattered, followed by the growing suspicion that she did not. Then came the illness. Not hers, her mother's. For 2 years, Eleanor had arranged her life around medicines, appointments, late-night telephone calls, and the careful disguising of fear. When her mother died, there was no dramatic collapse, only a gradual stillness in which ordinary things lost their shape. 6 months later, Ashcombe Cottage came to her. She opened the door. The air inside carried the faint smell of beeswax, old books, and lavender. Margaret's walking stick remained in the umbrella stand. A blue teacup sat upside down beside the sink. On the mantelpiece, the clock had stopped at 20 minutes past 4. Eleanor placed her suitcase in the narrow hallway and moved through the rooms without touching anything. The cottage seemed not abandoned, but paused. In the parlor, there was a small writing desk beneath the window. In the bedroom upstairs, a quilt had been folded with exact care. A row of Margaret's dresses hung in the wardrobe, all dark colors and sensible wool. Beside the bed was a novel with a sprig of rosemary pressed between its pages. Eleanor sat on the mattress and looked out through the window. From there, she could see the full length of the back garden. It sloped gently downward through a disorder of late summer growth. Fennel, foxglove stems gone to seed, lavender bushes, and a tangle of climbing beans that had long outgrown their supports. At the bottom stood the stone wall, weathered and softened by moss. Beyond it was the greenhouse. Margaret had mentioned it often enough, though never in detail. Eleanor remembered phrases from letters. "The keeper has repaired the west panes." "There were violets from the greenhouse today." "You would like the light here in winter." From the bedroom window, the structure appeared older than the cottage itself. It was long and narrow, with a cedar frame gone silver from weather. Several panes were clouded. Ivy climbed one and disappeared across the roof. A brick chimney rose from the far side. It looked abandoned. Yet a thin thread of smoke drifted from the chimney. Eleanor watched it until it vanished into the pale afternoon sky. Then she closed the curtain. On her third morning at Ashcombe, she discovered the gate had been repaired. It stood halfway down the garden, separating the orchard from the vegetable beds. The evening before, it had dragged heavily against the earth, one hinge nearly torn loose. Eleanor had made a note to find a hammer. Now it opened without sound. She tested it twice, then crouched to examine the new screws. They were not new at all, but old black iron ones, carefully cleaned and reset. She looked toward the neighboring houses. There were only 3 visible from the garden: a low thatched cottage beyond the eastern hedge, the vicarage roof behind a row of elms, and a square brick farmhouse across the lane. No one was outside. At the bottom of the garden, the greenhouse stood quiet behind the wall. Eleanor considered going down to look. Instead, she returned to the kitchen and made coffee. Later that morning, she walked into the village. Ashcombe consisted of one curving street, a church, a bakery, a post office that also sold wool and batteries, and a public house whose sign creaked above the door. The buildings leaned close together as though sharing secrets. The baker recognized her immediately. "You'll be Margaret's niece." He was a large, flour-dusted man with a mustache that moved independently of his mouth. "Eleanor." "Yes, she spoke of you. Said that you worked too hard." Eleanor glanced at him. "She did?" "Frequently." He placed a loaf of bread on the counter. "I didn't ask for that." "No, your aunt did." "My aunt has been dead for 6 months." "That never stopped Margaret from arranging things." He smiled and refused payment. Outside the bakery, Eleanor nearly collided with a small girl carrying a bunch of marigolds. "Sorry," the child said. "They're for the schoolroom." "They're beautiful." "They came from the keeper." Eleanor looked down the street. "The keeper?" But the girl was already run on. At the post office, the woman behind the counter confirmed that a gardener tended the greenhouse beyond Ashcombe Cottage. "What is his name?" Eleanor asked. The woman frowned as though the question were unexpectedly difficult. "I'm not certain anyone uses it." "You must know who he is." "Oh, yes." "Then what is his name?" The woman considered. "We call him the keeper." This answer appeared sufficient to her. Eleanor bought a box of matches and left. The days arranged themselves quietly. She unpacked only what she needed. She folded the rest of her clothes into drawers and stacked unopened boxes against the spare room wall. Each morning she opened the back door and stood on the step with her coffee. The garden changed in small ways. The weeds disappeared from around the sundial. A fallen branch was cut and stacked beside the shed. The climbing beans, which had collapsed in a green heap, were tied back against their supports. Eleanor told herself that someone from the village was helping because of Margaret. On the 7th morning, a basket appeared on the kitchen step. Inside were tomatoes, rosemary, late strawberries, and 2 small pears. A folded square of linen lay beneath them. There was no note. Eleanor carried the basket down the garden. The path narrowed beyond the orchard. At the stone wall, she found a wooden door set beneath an arch of ivy. It opened easily. On the other side, the air was warmer. The greenhouse stood 20 yards away. Up close, it was larger than she had imagined. Its cedar doors were painted a deep green, though the color had weathered away along the edges. Water barrels stood beneath the gutters. Rows of terracotta plants lined the outer wall. A pair of gardening gloves rested on a stone bench. Eleanor approached the nearest pane. Inside, she could see tables, shelves, trailing vines, and the faintest movement of leaves. She knocked on the glass. No one answered. The door was closed. She stood there with the empty basket on her arm, feeling faintly foolish. Then she noticed the small wooden peg beside the entrance. She hung the basket there and returned to the cottage. The following morning, it was back on her step, filled with apples. Autumn entered Ashcombe slowly. The trees did not change all at once. A few leaves turned amber, then red, while the rest remained green. Mist began to gather in the orchard at dawn. Eleanor found work in restoring the cottage. She washed curtains, polished brass, sorted drawers, and aired rooms that had been closed since Margaret's death. In the writing desk, she discovered years of letters tied with ribbon, receipts for seeds, recipes in Margaret's careful hand, and a notebook containing only the names of flowers. Besides certain names, Margaret had written small remarks. Sweet peas, for Mrs. Pembroke, who says their scent reminds her of childhood. Rosemary, for remembrance. White violets. E liked these once. Eleanor paused over the final line. She had liked white violets as a child. She had forgotten. That afternoon, she went into the village and asked the baker about the keeper. He keeps to himself, the baker said. Does he live in the greenhouse? Near enough. What does that mean? The baker shrugged and shaped dough beneath his palms. He's always there when needed. That is not the same thing. No. Has he always looked after the place? As far as I know. How long is that? Long enough. Eleanor leaned on the counter. Does no one in this village answer a question directly? The baker smiled. Your aunt used to say the same. As Eleanor turned to leave, he called after her. He knew Margaret well. She stopped. How well? But the baker had already carried his tray into the back room. A week later, Eleanor saw the keeper for the first time. Rain had fallen steadily since dawn. The gutters overflowed. The garden paths shone dark beneath the water. Late in the afternoon, Eleanor stood at the parlor window watching the storm bend the orchard trees. Beyond the stone wall, the greenhouse panes were silver with rain. A light moved inside. Then a figure passed behind the glass. A man, tall and slightly stooped, carrying a lantern. He paused near one of the windows. Eleanor could not see his face. For a moment, she had the strange impression that he was looking toward the cottage. Then he moved away. She put on Margaret's old raincoat and crossed the garden. By the time she reached the greenhouse, she was soaked to the knees. The cedar door remained closed. Warm mist clouded the panes from within. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. At last she tried the handle. It did not move. Eleanor stepped back, irritated by the rain, the silence, and her own unreasonable determination. "I know you're in there," she said. The rain struck the glass. No one answered. She returned to the cottage, angry, though she could not have said why. The next morning, the raincoat she had hung dripping in the kitchen was dry. On the table beside it lay a small bunch of white violets. After that, Eleanor began to notice how often the greenhouse entered village life. A bowl of herbs appeared outside the bakery each Thursday. Flowers stood beside the pulpit every Sunday, never elaborate, always exactly suited to the season. When Mrs. Pembroke took ill, fresh mint and chamomile were left on her doorstep. At the school, children planted wintergreens in wooden boxes built from smooth cedar. No one seemed to deliver these things. They simply arrived. "It's the keeper," people would say. They spoke of him without curiosity, as though speaking of rain or sunrise. Eleanor found this increasingly difficult to accept. One afternoon she visited Mrs. Pembroke, who lived in a narrow cottage facing the churchyard. The old woman sat beneath 3 blankets and regarded Eleanor with bright, intelligent eyes. "You have Margaret's forehead," she said. "I'm told that is not a compliment." It wasn't when she said it. Eleanor poured tea. "Did you know the keeper?" Mrs. Pembroke took her cup. "I know him." "What is he like?" "Kind." "Everyone says that." "Then perhaps it is true." "Kindness is not a description." "It is when one has known enough unkindness." Eleanor looked toward the window. On the sill stood a pot of rosemary. "Did he bring that?" "Yes." "When?" "When I needed it." Eleanor sighed. Mrs. Pembroke watched her over the rim of the cup. "You are trying very hard to discover him without meeting him." "I have tried to meet him." "No. You have tried to summon him." The words stung because they were gentle. "I knocked. And when he did not answer in the manner you expected, you left." "What else was I meant to do?" Mrs. Pembroke smiled. "Perhaps wait." Winter came early. The first snow fell before the end of November, thin and uncertain, melting as it touched the roads. By December, the hills around Ashcombe had turned white. Eleanor had never lived through a country winter. The quiet deepened. Footsteps carried across frozen ground. Smoke hung low above chimneys. The days narrowed to a few pale hours between darkness. The greenhouse became a lantern beyond the wall. Each evening, warm light glowed through its misted panes, Eleanor could sometimes see the keeper's shadow moving between the tables. She no longer went down to knock. Instead, she watched from the cottage. There were nights when the light comforted her, though she would not have admitted it. Grief had altered in the countryside. In the city, it had been sharp and hidden, something she managed between appointments and errands. At Ashcombe, it came without warning. A cup in Margaret's cupboard, a melody played on the church organ, the smell of cold wool. Once, while sorting a box of Christmas ornaments, Eleanor found a paper angel she had made as a child. Margaret had kept it 32 years. She sat on the floor and wept until the room grew dark. When she finally rose, she saw a figure standing at the garden wall. The keeper. He wore a dark coat and held a lantern. Snow moved around him. He did not wave. He did not approach. He simply stood there. Eleanor remained by the window. After a while, he lifted the lantern slightly, as though in acknowledgement. Then he turned and disappeared through the ivy door. The following morning, a narrow path had been cleared from the cottage to the greenhouse. Eleanor did not use it. The storm came on the longest night of the year. By dusk, snow had buried the garden wall and filled the lanes. The wind drove against the cottage in long, low gusts. Power failed before midnight. Eleanor lit Margaret's candles and fed wood into the parlor grate. At 1 o'clock, a branch struck the roof. At 2, something shattered near the kitchen. At 3, the fire began to die. The wood box was empty. Eleanor wrapped herself in blankets and sat close to the hearth, listening to the wind. There was wood in the shed, but the path had vanished. She told herself she would wait until morning. Then came a sound at the back of the cottage. 3 soft knocks. Eleanor sat upright. Again, 3 knocks. Not at the front door, at the kitchen door. She carried a candle through the dark hallway. When she opened the door, the wind blew the flame out. No one stood there. A stack of firewood had been placed beneath the eaves, covered with canvas. Beyond it, a line of lanterns marked the path through the snow. 1 at the orchard gate, 1 beside the sundial, 1 beneath the ivy arch. Eleanor stood in the doorway, the cold pressing around her. The greenhouse shone more brightly than she had ever seen it. For several minutes she did not move. Then she carried the firewood inside, closed the door, and relit the fire. Morning brought silence. The storm had passed. The snow lay smooth and blue beneath a pale sky. Eleanor went outside shortly after dawn. The lanterns were gone, but the path remained clear. She followed it. At the stone wall, the ivy glittered with ice. Beyond it, the greenhouse stood warm against the snow. The cedar door was open, not wide, only a few inches. Light stretched across the threshold. Eleanor stopped. She heard no voice, no footsteps. From inside came the faint sound of water being poured. She might have turned back. For years she had become practiced at turning away from what she could not control. Invitations, apologies, affection, hope. Anything requiring trust seemed too costly. She looked toward the cottage. then at the open door. At last she stepped forward. Warmth met her first, then the scent of damp earth, cedar, citrus, and growing things. The greenhouse was larger inside than it appeared from the garden. Long tables held trays of seedlings. Vines climbed the rafters. Winter roses opened beside terracotta pots. Lemons glowed among glossy leaves. Birds moved somewhere near the roof. At the far end, a man stood beside a workbench. He was older than Eleanor had expected, though she could not have guessed his age. His hair was silver at the temples. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and soil darkened his hands. A kettle steamed beside him. 2 cups waited on the table. He looked up. There was no surprise in his face, only recognition. Eleanor remained near the door. "You knew I was coming." "I hoped you would." His voice was quiet. She looked at the cups. "You set out too." "I often do." "Why?" He smiled slightly. "Because sometimes someone comes." Eleanor glanced around the greenhouse. "You repaired the gate." "Yes." "And the beams." "Yes." "The roof after the storm." "Yes." "The violets." "Yes." "Why didn't you answer when I knocked?" The keeper considered this. "You came wanting proof." "I came wanting to meet you." "Not quite." Eleanor felt the old irritation rise, then fade. "No," she said, "not quite." He poured the tea. She came further inside. On the workbench lay several wooden trays filled with soil. Tiny green shoots had begun to rise from one of them. "What are those?" "Sweet peas." "In winter?" "They begin where it is warm." He handed her a cup. For a while neither spoke. Eleanor drank the tea. It tasted faintly of mint and honey. The keeper moved to another table and began transplanting seedlings from one tray into small clay pots. His hands were slow and careful. "May I help?" she asked. He looked at her. "Yes." He showed her how to loosen the roots without breaking them. Eleanor worked beside him. At first she tried to fill the silence with questions, but most of them seemed unnecessary once she formed them. The greenhouse was full of small sounds: the scrape of clay, the ticking stove, water dripping into a basin, the stirring of leaves overhead. After a time she said, "My aunt wrote about you." "I know." "She never told me much." "She thought you would come when you were ready." "I nearly didn't come at all." "Yes." "You knew that too?" "I knew it was difficult." Eleanor pressed soil around a seedling. "Why did she call you the keeper?" He smiled. "Because that is what I do." "Keep the greenhouse?" "Among other things." She waited, but he offered no explanation. Something in her loosened. By noon, the winter sun had broke through the clouds. Light poured across the glass roof and caught in the steam above the kettle. The keeper brought out bread, apples, and cheese. They ate at a small table beneath a flowering jasmine vine. Eleanor told him about her mother. She had not meant to. The words came slowly at first, then without order. She spoke of the hospital room, the long nights, the helpless anger, the guilt of relief when it was over. She spoke of the months afterward, when everyone expected her to recover because grief had become inconvenient. The keeper listened. He did not interrupt. He did not tell her that time would heal her. He did not explain suffering. When she had finished, he said only, "You are very tired." The simplicity of it undid her. "Yes," she whispered. He waited while she wept. Not beside her, not with his hand upon her shoulder. He remained across the table, giving her the dignity of being seen without being managed. When the tears passed, he poured more tea. Outside, snow slipped from the greenhouse roof in soft white sheets. They worked until the light began to fade. Eleanor repotted violets, tied jasmine vines, and carried water from the copper tank. The keeper showed her a lemon tree Margaret had planted many years before. "It nearly died once," he said. "What saved it?" "Time, warmth, pruning." Eleanor touched one of the leaves. "Margaret wrote that I liked white violets." She remembered. "So did you." "Yes." "How?" "She told me." 30 years ago?" He looked at her. "Yes." No pride, no emphasis. As though remembering were the most ordinary thing in the world. Near dusk, Eleanor put on her coat. The keeper walked her to the door. Beyond the glass, the path to the cottage lay blue beneath the snow. She stood at the threshold. "I don't know why I waited so long." He rested one hand against the cedar frame. Doors can seem heavier from the outside. Eleanor looked back into the greenhouse. The lamps had been lit. Warmth moved among the leaves. The 2 cups remained on the table. "Will the door be open tomorrow?" "The door has never been locked." She met his eyes. He did not ask her to return. He did not tell her what she ought to do. He simply stood there, patient and untroubled, as though there had always been time. Eleanor stepped outside. Halfway to the stone wall, she turned. The keeper remained in the doorway. The light behind him was steady. She raised one hand. He answered in the same way. Then she continued toward the cottage. That evening, Eleanor wound the clock in Margaret's mantelpiece. The hands began to move. In the weeks that followed, she returned often. Not every day. The keeper never asked why she had stayed away, nor praised her when she came. Sometimes they worked in silence. Sometimes they drank tea. Sometimes Eleanor spoke, and sometimes she did not. By spring, she had learned the names of the seedlings. She learned which roots disliked disturbance, which branches required cutting, and which plants appeared dead while life waited beneath the soil. The village noticed the changes in the cottage garden. The roses were pruned. The orchard gates stood open. White violets grew beside the kitchen step. One morning, the baker's young daughter came to collect marigolds for the schoolroom. She found Eleanor tying stems at the greenhouse table. "Are you the keeper now?" the child asked. Eleanor looked toward the far end, where the keeper was repairing a cracked clay pot. "No," she said. The child seemed disappointed. Eleanor smiled. "But I am learning how to help." Together they carried the flowers into the village. Behind them, the greenhouse door remained open, and through the old glass, quiet and faithful as morning, the light continued to shine. Some doors are opened with force. Others have simply been waiting. Perhaps the greatest kindness is not to be hurried, but to find one quiet morning that the light has been there all along.